I really came to write this book by accident when I was researching my last book, The Brother Gardeners, which is about the British obsession with gardens. And I would have never thought that that would lead me to write a book about the American founding fathers and gardens, especially in comparison to Britain, where everybody seems to be crazy about gardening. And I had never thought of America as a gardening nation, which is probably the wrong place to say because it's we are on Monticello's West Lawn, and it is the Virginia Garden Week. But I didn't know that. My first impressions of America were shaped in 1987 when I went on a road trip, 7 weeks road trip, from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And on that road trip, every single cliche a German teenager might have had in the late 1980s was absolutely confirmed. So I was in awe of shopping malls, endless drive-throughs, huge cars. Even the cartons where the orange juices were kept in was so much bigger than what I was used to in Germany. But what really stayed with me were the roads, the straight roads that just never seemed to curve, the vast fields. So it kind of felt like a country on which man had imposed a grid on nature. And even suburban America seemed on a larger scale. There were these big houses on big plots with not much gardening around it, but, big lawns, basically. And so I thought of America as this larger-than-life industrial country, and I never really thought of it in terms of gardening. But how wrong I was, because I think America is as much a gardening nation as Britain is, just a little bit different. When I researched the Brother Gardeners, I not only discovered, I'm going to lose my notes here, aren't I? So I'm just holding them. So when I researched the Brother Gardeners, I not only discovered how important American plants had been for the creation of the English garden, but also how important plants and nature had been for the creation of America. One of the protagonists in the Brother Gardener is the American farmer and plant collector John Bartram. He from the early 1730s, sent hundreds and hundreds of boxes full of seeds, American seeds, to England for over 40 years. And he completely transformed the English garden. And it was in Bartram's letters, really, that I realized this remarkable connection to the founding fathers. So he was a very good friend of Benjamin Franklin, for example, and it was in fact through Franklin that he had been introduced to the English gardeners. But as I read on through manuscripts and diaries and letters, I came across an account of a visit of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention to Bartram's garden, which is just outside Philadelphia. I found an invoice to George Washington, who had ordered hundreds of trees and shrubs for his garden in Mount Vernon. James Madison had visited, John Adams had visited, and Jefferson even found time to go there while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. But it was only when I followed Bartram's footsteps through the Appalachian Mountains in October 2006 that I realized just how important plants had been for the founding fathers. I was basically passing Charlottesville and thought, Charlottesville, Monticello, I'll just have a look at Jefferson's house. I want to see the home of the writer of the Declaration of Independence. And I walked up here and I went to the vegetable terrace, and I just couldn't believe really what I was seeing, because I thought that, this is really the work of a revolutionary gardener, and who had crafted his grounds as carefully, I think, as he had crafted his words. And I think that Monticello really is a monument to Jefferson's beliefs and philosophy, in that it can be read almost like his letters. And as such, Monticello really became the inspiration of this book. And I've said that every single talk I'm giving, but I didn't say it in Mount Vernon, nor in Montpellier. I thought they might be a little bit upset. So I realized that when I kind of read all this and kind of saw this, I kind of started to read. And I just found a picture which totally surprised me, because I realized that the first 4 American presidents had all used nature in one way or another in their fight for America. So there was George Washington, who I had known as the first president of the United States, the revolutionary hero. But what I didn't know is was that he was more likely to talk about the merits of plows or trees than actually to talk about politics. Once I'd seen Monticello, it became very clear that Jefferson was a revolutionary gardener. Madison, father of the Constitution, brilliant legal mind, but what I didn't know was that he was really the forgotten father of American environmentalism, who had tried to rally the Americans to stop destroying the forest and to deplete the soil, and who'd really, who talked about the balance of nature at a time when no one else was really talking about it. And then John Adams, who was the American minister in Paris and then in London and then the second president of the United States. But I didn't know that Adams had gone on an extended garden tour through England with Thomas Jefferson. And they really regarded themselves foremost as farmers and as gardeners, not as politicians. And when you actually go back to their letters and read their letters, you see that these letters are just full of references about their gardens, about their farms, about their fields, about swapping seeds. And if you, for example, look at Jefferson and Madison's letters, I mean, every single letter will mention somewhere nature, harvest time, seeds, plows. It's just there. It's kind of very much what they called the rural amusements, which preoccupied them very much. So I think that their passion for plants, gardens, and nature is deeply woven in the fabric of America, and is very much aligned to their political thought. And I think that they not only created the United States in a political sense, but also they really understood the importance of plants and nature. So as such, for me, I think we can look at, for example, golden cornfields and rows of cotton plants really as a symbol of America's economic independence from Britain, for example. Towering trees become the reflection of a strong nation. Native species become imbued with patriotism and were proudly planted in gardens. And metaphors drawn from the natural world really bring the kind of gardening world and plants into the world of politics. And I think we really have to look at the Founding Fathers as farmers and gardeners to understand the making of America. This is played out on many different levels. The most obvious one is the economic level, really, which is the importance of good agricultural crops for a country's self-sufficiency and therefore for the independence of a country. It works on an ideological level, which is the Jeffersonian vision of America as an agrarian republic. It works metaphorically because they all used metaphors drawn from nature to explain politics. It works in terms of national identity because America's landscape became invested with patriotic meaning, and it works literally and symbolically in their gardens, which become canvases of kind of patriotic statements. But let me take you to the summer of 1776. America has just declared independence. Manhattan is an armed camp where soldiers drill in the streets. George Washington is the commander-in-chief of the army. And New York is facing 30,000 British troops. This is the largest enemy fleet that has ever arrived at America's shores. And George Washington has about half the manpower. Very few of his officers have experienced battle. No one has seen warships as imposing as the ones which are sailing towards New York. So there he is, George Washington in New York, as the city braces itself for the first and largest battle of the War of Independence. He thinks of his garden in Mount Vernon. One evening in his headquarters, just days before the battle, he brushes aside his generals and his military maps, and he writes a letter to his estate manager in Mount Vernon, asking him to design a new garden. So as the chaos of cannons and blood is looming, he is thinking about the beautiful blossom of mountain laurel, about pink blossom of the red bud, which we can see over there. He is talking about soaring pines and oak trees. He's talking about tulip poplars, flowering dogwoods, and the fringe tree, magnolias. So at the moment, at the very, very moment, as the young nation is threatened to be crushed by the almighty British army, he is designing an all-American garden. And I think what is even more remarkable than his timing is really that he's choosing native species. So this is, this is something absolutely radical and new, because at that time, kind of colonialist, the typical colonialist garden would be a garden which would be a kind of more a recreation of the old world. So they wanted to have European plants. And we can see that if we look, for example, at John Bartram's customers. Because Bartram, in his nursery in Philadelphia, he was growing Native American species, but his customers were English, and his American customers were buying European plants from him, which he had received from England. So I think that Mount Vernon is the first truly American garden. Or let me say it like this. It is the first truly ornamental American garden. And I think it is Washington's private statement of independence. But let's go to Jefferson. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson experienced something very similar when they go on a garden tour through England in 1786. At that time, Adams is the American minister in London and Jefferson is the American minister in Paris. And in spring 1786, Adams writes a letter to Jefferson asking him to come to London to help him with the difficult trade negotiations with the British. But they're in no luck. The British hate the Americans. No one is interested in helping their former colonies. In fact, they're so rude that Jefferson speculates if it might be the amount of meat consumed by the British that, and this is a quote, renders their character insusceptible of civilization. So what do? They go on a garden tour. And this garden tour is really not a leisurely trip. And I think, so basically what they do is they travel every day they travel about 40 to 50 miles. They see several gardens a day, and these are big landscape gardens. So they don't have time to, stroll through a garden. They're literally ticking off as many as possible. But they both adored, they were very different characters, but they both adored gardens. And John Adams is very much a hands-on gardener who gets his hands dirty and who kind of works off, whenever he has a political battle, he needs to go into his garden and kind of work in the soil. He loves digging in his potato yard. Jefferson, also in his garden, also hands-on, but a little bit more theoretical. Is that okay? Okay. Well, I think the big difference maybe is that John Adams has a much smaller garden and doesn't have a lot of money, so he's never attempting to recreate these kind of big pleasure grounds, while Jefferson comes up with lots of garden ideas which, might not make it from his notes to the soil. But anyway, let's go to the garden tour. So they kind of tick off as many gardens as possible, and what they see are so-called ornamental farms. And these are gardens which combine the beauty of a pleasure ground with the agricultural elements of a working farm. So these are gardens where you will find shrubberies, but you'll also find fields and pasture and sheep in the garden. And it's this combination of the beautiful and of the useful that very much chimed with Adams and Jefferson's vision of America, of a continent of beauty and vast fields that would feed the nation. And they would both incorporate elements of what they had seen in England later in their gardens in America. But the most exciting revelation was really that they discovered that the English garden is not English at all. In fact, it was densely populated with American trees and shrubs. And normally I have a lovely slideshow and I would be showing you white pines and southern catalpa and the fringe tree and dogwood, but we have to kind of look around a little bit to imagine that. So what Adams and Jefferson saw in the English garden were actually the growths and clumps that had grown over the past 5 decades from John Bartram's seeds. So they discovered that the English were in fact absolutely crazy about American trees and shrubs, and that the English garden was in fact American. So, in a strange twist, at the very moment as the colonies declared independence, the English garden was actually filled with the trees and shrubs from her former colonies. And Jefferson, who very much admired the English garden, was quite delighted, I suppose, to discover that he could now, in a very patriotic way, admire the English garden, because the English garden was kind of American, really. But plants also played an important role for the economy and the independence of the country. Benjamin Franklin, for example, in the run-up to the Declaration of Independence in the early 1770s, when he was in London, started to send increasing amounts of useful or potentially useful seeds of crops and vegetables from London to America. And in a way, his intensifying involvement with plants can almost be seen as a kind of barometer of his political convictions, because the more he believed that independence was inevitable, the more plants and seeds he was sending over from London to America. And similarly, Jefferson, who believed that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. In fact, so important, I'm sure Peter Hatch had told this story often, but I will anyway say it, that so important was this introduction of new species for Jefferson, that when he was judging the services to his country later in his life, he added to the same list, which included the Declaration of Independence, also the introduction of his introduction of upland rice to America. In the early 1790s, when Jefferson and Madison feared that Alexander Hamilton, who was then the Secretary of the Treasury, was going to turn America into a nation of merchants and traders and speculators, they turned to America's plants almost like what you could almost call botanical weapons against this new vision of America. They went in the summer of 1791 on a botanical tour through the New England states, and they met landowners there and they took notes on agriculture, but most of all, they wanted to learn as much as possible about the cultivation of sugar maples. And because they believed that if enough American farmers would plant sugar maple orchards, they could produce enough sugar so that the Americans would not have to buy molasses from the British West Indies anymore. Is this thunder? And that would then avoid them trading with the old enemy. So the sugar maples became this kind of weapon against Hamilton's kind of vision of commerce, really. And the editor of the Vermont Gazette was so convinced of their plan after Jefferson and Madison visit that he wrote in the Vermont Gazette, "The attention to our sugar orchard is essentially necessary to secure the independence of our country." All of them, Adams, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, all agreed that agriculture should be the foundation of America. Jefferson said, "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly agricultural." They were all experimenting, for example, with crop rotation. Jefferson designed the moldboard for a plow. Washington was the first American to collect farm dung in a specially designed building. And I have to say, it kind of took me by surprise to discover that the first 4 presidents of the United States were all utterly obsessed with manure. Washington, in fact, was so enraptured by it that he wanted a farm manager who would Midas-like convert everything he touches into manure as the first transmutation towards gold. Jefferson called a pamphlet about manure a charming treatise. And I think there's hardly a more delightful picture than John Adams as the American minister in London, literally jumping into a pile of manure off the Edgware Road, clearly not minding the muck on his hands because he was like teasing apart the straw from the dung and then gleefully declaring that the stinking pile was not equal to mine. So this obsession might seem a little strange to us, but it's very much part of their political agenda because, of course, farming was the livelihood of most Americans, but they also believed that the independent farmer with their small self-sufficient farms, that they were the foot soldiers of the infant nation. And with the elevation of the small farmer as the guardian of liberty, mundane tasks, or seemingly mundane tasks, such as collecting manure or devising crop rotations, became important parts of nation building. So plowing, planting, vegetable gardening were much more than just profitable occupations. They became political acts that brought freedom and independence. So the improvement of agriculture really became a Republican endeavor. And as Madison said, the more prosperous farmers lived in the country, the more free, the more independent, and the more happy must be society itself. So gardens themselves also became canvases on which to really paint a political statement. We've seen that with the All-American Garden in Mount Vernon, but Monticello can be also read in this way. When Jefferson retired from his presidency in 1809, he created a garden that I think was very much a reflection of his vision of America: beautiful, sublime, strong, fertile, and agrarian. Like Washington before him, he couldn't wait to return to his fields and his garden, and he wrote, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power. From now on," he said, "he would only talk about plants and harvest, and if the topic changes to politics, I meddle little with them." So from morning to evening, he was really outside on his plantation, on horseback, or in his garden, singing to himself and taking lots of notes. And, he was a very, very happy man here. And Monticello is like a living tapestry of the themes that had so long occupied him. So there were the rolling views over America's landscape, which is really, I think, his celebration of America's spectacular landscape and the beauty of it. There were the plants that Lewis and Clark had brought back from their expedition. They were a reminder of the promises that lay in the West. There were agricultural fields within the pleasure ground on the mountain, in the forest, which is, I think, a manifestation of Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic. And then there was, am I looking at the right side? Yes, the vegetable terrace, which was, it is his experimental hub, his scientific lab, because the introductions of species and the experimentation with different species is so important for him. And I think Monticello is a really very carefully staged landscape, a kind of journey when you started at the bottom of the mountain through the untamed forest. Then halfway up the mountain, he would introduce the first agricultural fields. Then he would lead his visitor through the 18-acre carefully planned grove, vegetable terrace, and then up here to the lawn. So it's this journey almost from the wilderness to the refined. So it's like a journey from the wilderness to civilization in a way. Madison and Adams also crafted their grounds very carefully, but I'm not going to talk about that because we are here. But I thought, with the first 4 presidents all being so passionate about their gardens, I'm going to have just so much fun researching the White House garden. It's just going to be great. They're going to have created something really amazing there. And nothing. I could not find anything. So for a while I thought maybe this whole book is just going to collapse because my thesis is wrong. But as a good historian, I found a way out. And I think that the non-existing garden in the White House is actually also a political statement. Yeah. Let me explain. Let's go back to the creation of Washington D.C. and in the 1790s, and really it's something which very much involves Washington and Jefferson, because both of them agreed that the capital should reflect the government and its power, or in Jefferson's case, the lack of power. So the difference really is that Washington believes in a strong federal government, and he thinks that this should be expressed in the capital. Jefferson, as a Republican, does not believe that. He thinks that the federal government should be as inobtrusive and out of the way as possible. So what they're doing is that Washington gets Charles L'Enfant, to design the capital as this very grand, imposing city, while Jefferson draws up a plan for the capital, which is a small, organically kind of grown city, which will grow from its center. And so you have this massive, so for example, L'Enfant's map is so big that Jefferson says to Madison, you have to come over to have a look at it because it's too big to carry over. So and L'Enfant basically puts there's a lot of politics in the way the city is laid out. So you, for example, you have the White House and the Capitol, and they're 1.5 miles away. So this is like the legislative and the executive are separated also on the, you know, on the map of the city. Anyway, it took a decade to build, and Adams was the first president to move in there, but he only had 4 months living there, so he didn't have time to create much of a garden there. And then Jefferson is really the first president who properly lives in the White House. So when he moves there, what he finds is pretty much a building site. Instead of fountains, there are piles of rubbish. There are, you know, pits with carcasses of cattle putrefying and workman shacks. And strangely, Jefferson, who adores gardens, is not going to change anything about this. He's going to leave this garden as ramshackle and as provincial as possible, because his garden would not exude grandeur or power. And because as a Republican, he wanted to have his government as invisible as possible. So from the day of his inauguration, he really does a lot to demystify the office of the president. He doesn't have big public audiences anymore. He gets rid of all kinds of pomp. He has intimate dinners. He puts in on a round table so that there's no sense of hierarchy. His invites he signs as T. Jefferson rather than President of the United States, as Washington and Adams had done. And the man who had worn fine silks and ruffles in France was now deliberately dressing down. And visitors did notice that. So, for example, they remarked that his hair was neglected, his slippers were worn with his toes out, the coat was threadbare, and the linen much soiled. He looked, as one British diplomat said, like a tall, large-boned farmer, exactly the image that Jefferson wanted to convey. What Jefferson did do in D.C. was that he encouraged tree planting in the streets, he supported local nurserymen by giving them seeds, and he asked his steward to give the highest prices to the best and the earliest vegetables he could buy at the markets to encourage market gardeners. For 6 years, Jefferson did absolutely nothing in the garden at the White House. And then, one evening in spring 1807, he turned his attention to the garden. We don't know what piqued his interest, but it might have been that the popularity of the Republican Party had kind of really diminished the threat of the Federalists, because he had won his second term with a huge majority. Maybe having decided to retire after the second term, he thought, probably better I put in a garden there rather than my successor putting a little mini Versailles in there. We don't know. But like Washington and Mount Vernon, he envisaged an all-American garden. And towards the end of his presidency, he drew up a list of plants he wanted to have in the White House garden, which were all native species. However, there was hardly any money left to spend on the grounds at the White House, and all he could do was to level the ground. And I think this is his most important legacy, really, in the White House garden. He enclosed it and made it much, much smaller. So the garden that Washington and L'Enfant had envisaged had 60 acres. Now, that is a huge presidential garden. And Jefferson enclosed it and made it a very modest 5 acres. So that's really what he has, left at the White House, I think. So if the White House and D.C. were built as a reflection of the federal government, Jefferson was probably quite delighted when he left, because the avenues might have looked grand on paper, but diplomats and congressmen still got stuck in the mud in Pennsylvania Avenue, and travelers who thought they had lost their way because they were standing in the middle of nowhere were surprised to hear that they were standing at the center of the Capitol. Washington, D.C., when Jefferson left, was a truly Republican city. But I would like to end with what for me was really the greatest surprise when I wrote this book, which is that even the environmental movement can be traced back to the Founding Fathers. In 1818, James Madison said in a widely circulated speech that the protection of the environment was essential for the survival of America. Now, he did not suggest to live in misty-eyed harmony with nature, But what he said is that nature is a fragile ecological system that could be easily destroyed by mankind, and that if man wanted to live off nature in the long term, he had to change something. So he condemned the Virginians for their ruthless exploitation of the soil and the destruction of the forest. And he really feared that what he called nature's balance would be unhinged. And he said something which I think is absolutely extraordinary. He said that man had to return to nature what man took from nature. And these are radical ecological views, because this is a time when most people still believe that animals and plants had been created by God entirely for the use of man. And Madison says at that time, he says that humankind could not expect that nature can be made subservient to the use of man. He said that man had to find a place within nature without destroying it. Words which I think remain as important today as they were when he spoke them. Thank you.
Well, Andrea would be happy to answer any questions, so let him rip.
Good, no one is daring. Oh, yes.
Real impressed with your current tour going from Mount Vernon and Montpelier and Monticello and the plantations of South Carolina and Duke Gardens. What's been the response to your thesis at each of those, and what kinds of questions do you get?
Well, first of all, I did have a presidential run. In 3 days, I've done 3 presidential homes, which was very nice. The questions I get is, there are a lot of questions about native species, in terms of, is that something Americans should kind of turn back to if if the first presidents kind of looked after that. Most people kind of go with my thesis, but I didn't, for example, I didn't give you my most speculative one, which is that I'm arguing that a visit to Bartram's garden might have changed the course of history. Now that is the one I get a lot of questions about, so I thought I'm saving myself this one here. No, I think people actually quite like this idea that the soil and nature was really important. Although, you have to bear in mind, I'm talking to a garden audience also. I got a few suggestions that they said I should speak to Congress. It's like, I'd love that gig. I think most people are really also surprised about Madison and the environmental movement. That's just something which has been really, really forgotten. And if you think how much the founding fathers are used for, for the whole political spectrum, really, be quite nice if the environmental movement kind of, takes a bit of that and argues their case with that.
Andrea, was Madison, did he pick that up from, were there European philosophers and ecologists and so forth, or was he kind of unique in that position? Because we were still so small, and we thought we had this whole huge continent yet that we could conquer for ourselves. To have that kind of extraordinary vision is truly remarkable. And I'm curious if he picked that up from European.
What he did is, he did something very similar what he did when he was compiling his notes for the Constitutional Convention. He looked at everything he could get his hands on in terms of agricultural improvements, agricultural chemistry. He looked at Malthus population, growth of population. He looked at everything he could get his hands on, and then he brought it together. So not a single bit of what he's saying in this speech is original. Nothing is something he comes up with, but he's the first to bring it all together and to actually make a case for the environment. And he's not using the word ecology. They don't quite understand the idea of a cycle, carbon cycle, energy cycles are not known yet, but he's making this link of that this idea of a balance of nature, that you take something out, you put something back. That's why they're also obsessed with manure, for example. I think he is radical in that sense that he's really understanding what's happening here is bad, but I think it's because he's in Virginia and he's seeing. I mean, this is the decline of Virginia. This is the early 19th century, and he is seeing. They're all feeling the effects of tobacco on the soil, and they're seeing that the small farmers, they're foot soldiers of this republic. They're fleeing towards the west. So something has to be changed.
So when Jefferson and Adams went trotting off to the English countryside to see these gardens, first of all, as Americans, were they warmly received? I guess it was easier to get in than it is now to see some of those gardens. And also, did they have any kind of comments about sort of the new landscapes that Lancelot Brown and Humphrey Repton had created?
Well, first of all, actually, in one garden, in Woburn Farm, Jefferson was actually only allowed in because he was American, because they had so much problems with vandalism in gardens that the servant at the gate said, the owner is not letting any English person in, and Jefferson was rather offended and said, well, I'm not English, I'm American. So they did not have problems getting in, because it was at that time it was very common to, pay the servant 6 pence or something like that, and then to be, let around the gardens. They comment on the gardens. They don't write anything particular, about designers. I mean, Jefferson is mainly writing down how many people it takes to maintain a garden like this. So he's kind of obviously thinking about, what can I do here? And they're both mentioning what they like and what they don't like. They criticize sometimes if the path is still too straight. There's not enough. There's too much art in here. It doesn't look natural enough. So they clearly like they very much praise more the kind of ornamental the ornamental farms. They like the combination of the beautiful and the useful, and but they're not mentioning Lancelot Brown, for example. They're not saying like we like this garden because Lancelot Brown designed it. Yes.
As I understood it in the book, obviously Adams was passionate about his garden, but he leaned more on the Federalist side on the political side. So what would speak to that whole dichotomy between the agricultural and the Republicans and the Federalists and the merchants?
Well,
What would be the exception?
well, I mean, Adams is a difficult case because Adams is actually a Federalist who hates merchants, which kind of, which is in terms of agriculture and gardening, you can kind of, in that sense, can push him a little bit more towards Jefferson and Madison and Washington. And in fact, it is in the mid 1790s when party politics become more and more obvious, and the first election kind of fought on party lines is then that agriculture is actually the only topic those four can still write about. They still talk about their farms, their seeds. So I think that Adams is therefore slightly different because Adams has constant fights with Hamilton, for example. I mean, Hamilton is backstabbing his own presidential candidate. So although he's like the only Federalist president, he's not really a Federalist in that sense. Because, for example, Abigail gets very upset because Adams is refusing to buy any stocks in the Federal Bank, and she later says, we would have made more money with that than we ever made with our land, because Adams believed that you could only invest in land. That was for him as important as for the others. Yes.
I'd be interested in your definition of gardener versus farmer. There's a lot of Americans that grew up on the farm and didn't have time to garden. You only had time for farming, and George Washington's sometimes seen as a farmer as opposed to a gardener. And just what's your views on how you figured out that these were all gardeners instead of farmers?
Well, I mean, farmers are for me the ones who are like literally in the field. I think all of them are both because they're all doing vegetable gardening, for example, which I call gardening rather than farming, and but they're all doing also ornamental gardening. So, although Washington has been always seen as a farmer, he's out there choosing trees for his shrubberies. Now that for me is gardening. I think he dies a gardener's death because he goes, he's outside in December, choosing trees for his shrubberies, and then he gets into a hailstorm, he gets very wet, and he comes back for dinner and he doesn't change his clothes, and then 3 days later he's dead. So that's a gardener's death, not a farmer's death. I don't know, does that answer your question?
One more question.
Yes.
What is your next project? And Peter too. What is your next writing project?
Well, I have started a book which is not about gardens. Yeah, so I'm writing about the transit of Venus, which happened in the 18th century, and which was the only way to measure the distance between Earth and Sun. But you needed hundreds of observers across the world looking at the same time at the sky to calculate it. So it's the 18th century, it's science again. Benjamin Franklin is in all my books. He's back in there. So it's an international collaboration in the 18th century. And it's coming out, I have a very tight deadline because the next transit of Venus for 125 years is next June.
Yeah, I have to still have a little bit more work to do on this book, and so I'm just looking forward to that. I'm not sure I've thought too much about what goes on beyond that, but the plan is to go on a book tour. This is Miss Book Tour right here.
Isn't he great?
There's someone who really wants to ask a question, so we'll have one more question.
So have you spent much time in Philadelphia? Been to Franklin Institute?
Say that again, please.
Have you spent much time in Philadelphia? Have you been to the Franklin Institute?
I have not been to the Franklin Institute, but I've spent a lot of time in the library of the American Philosophical Society and in Bartram's garden.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.